things that you discover as a teacher is that what you used to think was a skill is actually about 10 steps. That's for an adult, and for a child it's more like 20 steps. So part of the skill of teaching and part of what comes with experience, the more you do it, is figuring out what are the little tiny pieces that you need to break that skill down into, and it depends on the age of the child how many pieces you need to break it down to. A good rule of thumb is that child should be able to get that component skill in about 3 tries. They should be able to have a pretty perfect example of whatever it is that you're going for in about 3 tries. If they're really struggling, if we're getting into 4 tries, 5 tries, and they haven't done it yet, then you probably missed a step in the sequencing. So you want to back it off, figure out what the step is underneath the one that you're going for, and then move on to the next step, either later in the lesson or probably more like next lesson. Now, sometimes I will discover a little too late that I've missed a step in the sequencing, and now that child in front of me is starting to get a little maxed out, a little frustrated. They're starting to maybe have some self-doubt because I haven't made that skill easy enough for them to get quickly. If that happens, then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pivot away from that. I'm going to leave it alone for the rest of the lesson. And I am going to, make either a physical note or a mental note to come back to that next lesson. And of course, next lesson, when I come back to it, I'm going to make sure that I have hit the appropriate level in the sequencing. And a lot of times at the end of the lesson, I'll sort of have a side conversation with the parent and let them know the decision that I made, and also tell them, don't worry about practicing that at home. We're going to come back to that next lesson. They weren't quite ready. We'll try a lower step next time. In addition to sequencing the physical skills of learning the violin, we're also going to be sequencing those individual songs. And where I usually start is I'll kind of pull out the hardest part of the song, and I'll let the child know that I'm doing that, and they know that the first thing that they need to do whenever they're starting on a new song, play through it, have an experience of the whole thing, and then figure out, there's usually one little phrase or one little measure that's really getting them tangled up. So you take that little bit and you make a segment out of it. I teach the child the word segment very, very early on. They know the word segment, they know the word segmenting, they know that it means to break something into little pieces. So we're going to do that segment 5 or 6 or 7 times. We're going to use a practice game probably with that. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to pick another segment of the song. And we're going to do that a few times, and then we're going to put them together. And I also share with them that this is kind of the sequence that they're going to do when they practice at home. And I'll quiz them on how to structure learning that song. So we'll review not only the song itself, but we will also review the strategizing component of that. So from the very beginning, they're starting to at least have an awareness of those sort of learning sequencing skills, so that as they get old enough, they do have enough information that they can start making those decisions on their own. If you wait to talk about some of those sequencing things until they're older, it's a little late, because they're ready to have that information at the beginning, and if they have it from the beginning, they can start to practice whatever they can at the age that they're at, and gradually taking more and more responsibility for that as they go. What's happening as we're doing all of these segments isn't necessarily that they're learning the song. They know these songs. They've been listening to the songs on the CD. They can sing the song from beginning to end. It's not that they don't have the song in their auditory memory. What is difficult about playing it on the violin is there's a multitasking component. They're having to figure out the patterns in their fingers, whether it's on the piano, whether it's on the fiddle itself. They're having to understand higher and lower notes. And when they get into the middle of all of the notes, in the middle of a phrase, there's sort of all of this information swirling around. So they need to have a much deeper, more analytical, more pattern-oriented understanding of the song than what you get by simply listening to a song and being able to sing it back. So as they're doing the segments, they're building that understanding of the patterns, they're building the understanding of the sequences, of similarities between sections, and of the higher and lower properties of the notes, skips and steps. And then of course the other thing that's happening is that physical skill, the sequence patterns in their fingers, is gradually going from something that they have to concentrate on to what we call muscle memory. Now, muscle memory obviously is not located in our muscles, and I teach my students that even though we call it that, where it's actually located is the cerebellum. When we learn something, it takes an active concentration to figure out, how to move my body this way, which finger to do, and then after that I do this finger, and that's all something that's happening in the cerebral cortex and motor cortex. As we get more and more and more practice on something, that information is being stored by the brain as, oh, I need to remember this and I want to store this on the long term. And it gradually moves back into the cerebellum. So anything that you had to learn how to do as a very small child, walking, skipping, talking, that and has now become automatic. Like I can button my shirt while having a conversation. That's because that information is stored in my cerebellum. So as we learn to play the violin, a lot of what's happening on a physical level is that those skills that are require concentration initially, as they're practicing, are moving back into the cerebellum. And then we can add another multitasking layer, because only one of those multitasking layers actually requires concentration, and all of the other skills that they're doing simultaneously have already been stored in the cerebellum. As we're going through that learning process, at some point along the way, I share with my even very young student what the brain processes are as they're going through that. And this is really, really helpful for a young child, because they don't necessarily know that the reason that they can't do something is because that their brain is actually building new neural pathways. For them, it's a very personal thing, like I can't do this, and this, my friend can do that, and there's something that's better about my friend because they can do it, and I'm not as good because I can't. And what they need to know to really empower them is that their brain requires a certain amount of time to actually incorporate a new skill, and that there's little nerve cells that are growing, and they grow at whatever rate they grow, and you can't hurry them up. And when you're first starting to learn something, there's like an initial period where you're getting much better very quickly, and that's because there's a familiarization aspect of what you're doing. You're learning the song for the first time, and you're seeing some real quick results. And then there's a plateau where the song is not really continuing to get better. It's you know it fairly well, but it's not necessarily super fluid, and it's not memorized yet. Perhaps you still get stuck in some places, and it stays in that place for a little while. Well, what's happening is that song needs to move from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum, to where that whole song is now sort of its own action pattern. And I let my students know, and I let the parents know, this is what's happening. So you need to just keep hanging out with the song during that intermediate stage while you're not seeing a lot of stuff happen. But even though nothing is happening on the surface, there's a lot that's happening in your brain. And eventually you're going to get to that point where that song is fluid and it's mastered and you totally own it. So just stay with that process, and it empowers them to know what that process is so that they're not taking it personally.